Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing the album Peace by the band Zingalé.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So of course, before we get into this album, let me just share with you quickly some of my favorite bits off of this album, so enjoy. So as I said, this album is Peace by Zingalé. This is our first Israeli prog album on this list, and as an Israeli person myself, I was quite excited for it beforehand. Now, this album was recorded back in 1975 and 1976 and released in 1977. Now, this album was made by a bunch of people who most of them fought in the 1973 Yom Kippur War or either lost friends or relatives in that war. Now, the ideas and memories of the war is what made this album come to life, and it really inspired the concept of this album, which is the same as its name, Peace. And I actually saw an interview with one of the band members on here, which is Johnny Stern, and he was talking about his experience in the war and the music. So he was telling a story about when he was in the Sinai Peninsula and he was sitting in a trench that he dug, and then he started hearing an Egyptian plane coming down, diving toward him, and he said that the intensity, the sound of it just stuck him to the ground and made him feel an immense sense of overwhelmness, and at that moment he wished he had dug the trench like 1 or 2 meters deeper. But then of course the plane passed by, and with it left a void in his heart, as he says it, and that void is what he basically tried to fill using the music found on this album. Now, before I get to dissecting the music found on here, I have to give you some context. So back in 70s Israel, none of prog was basically known to the public, and prog was basically still a very experimental genre in the Israeli populace. And a part of the idea that made Zingalé want to create this album is to actually spark an interest in the prog scene in Israel for the first time. And that is not to say that there was no prog music in Israel beforehand, but still there were a lot of efforts made to actually make it more popularized with the common masses. But today this prog album is pretty obscure in the Israeli prog scene and overall in the worldwide prog scene. But that was not meant to be. You see, back in 1975, when the recording of this album began, the band actually got a contract with an international publisher called Decca, who said that they would release this album internationally when it was done. And so came the time in 1977 when this album was basically due and ready, and then Decca just bailed out of their agreement with the band and left them stranded with an album in their hands. So desperately, Zingalé just went ahead and tried to find a new publisher, and they got in touch with Record Hi-Fi back in the day, and Record Hi-Fi was like, okay, we're gonna remaster this album, we're gonna do another mixing, and we're gonna try and release it. But they didn't put a lot of effort into it and only ended up releasing 750 copies on vinyl, and those copies today are pretty rare and pretty well sought after by prog fans here in Israel and in the rest of the world. And although there were reissues of this album made afterwards, Zingalé and the Peace album, they're not really common household albums until this very day, and they're still pretty obscure even here in Israel. So how is the music on this album? Well, I guess the most glaring issue with this album is the fact that the recording and mixing on here really is pretty bad. It sounds like this album is in its demo stage and it sounds unfinished, and that's just a shame because the music found on here is genuinely good. And I'm sure that if the mixing was done correctly and it would have sounded really polished, I think I would have enjoyed this album a whole lot more. And although the singing on here is not so overly fantastic in any way, and I guess that's understandable, the musicianship and the instrumentation on here is pretty good. Now, as for the style of music found on here, I would categorize it as being on the edge of psychedelic rock and jazz, and it's not like it's a bit of both, it just really takes heavy inspiration from both, so I have to give it to both of them. I said both a lot of times, so excuse me. But one thing I loved about this album is the fact that it stayed engaging for its entire runtime, and I did not zone out for a moment, and I had really good time just listening to this album and enjoying it at its fullest. And I really love the plethora of melodical sounds and ideas found on the song Carnival, and I can safely say that it is my favorite track on this album by a long shot. Oh, and there's this one song on here which is called 1 Minute Prayer, and if you're gonna listen to it, you're gonna be very confused because you can clearly tell that it's 45 seconds of something else, one other song being played in reverse. So I actually took the liberty and took that song into a recording software and reversed it, or re-reversed it again, let's say, and I actually found out that it's a segment of another song of Zingalé, which is an unreleased song, at least wasn't released back in the day, and that song is called Everything Will Be Okay, and I don't know why they put it on here. It's not a prayer in any way, but it really does sound kinda odd, and I guess it is a wake-up call for any listener that's listening to this and kinda zoned out for a bit. And although this is a mostly instrumental album, there are certain tracks found on here which include lyrics, and they include quite a lot of lyrics. And the fact is, when searching, or at least trying to search for the lyrics of this album online, you'd basically get no results because it's really obscure and nobody knows about it. And I went ahead and did some extra research myself and asked a few friends around, and I got a lyrics sheet from a person who told me that this was added with the Japanese release of this album, which was made later on. Now, he assumes that those lyrics were basically transcribed by ear, which means they might not be perfect, and that also means that the original lyrics for this album may have been lost forever in time. But what I do know, and what I could understand from the mixing itself, which is, as I said, pretty horrible, I could understand a lot of things that we're talking about peace and the striving for it. Now, as I mentioned in yesterday's episode at the end, I have something really special for you all, and that is an actual interview with a band member or two of this band talking about this album being Peace. So this is where I intervene. I'm going off script right here, but I said a moment ago that I have to you all an interview with one of the members of the band, and I did do that interview, and his name is Efraim Barak. He is one of the lead singers and guitarist on this album, and he had a lot to say about this album. He was really surprised when I actually approached him about it, because somewhat, it kind of fell out of relevancy, this album, and it was really surprising for him. And he told me a lot of things about the making of this album. He told me about how it was supposed to be released by Decca, which were Warner Brothers, but it didn't get released at the end. He told me about the influences, about people who lost other people in the war and some people who have fought in it. He told me about the influences of the war, and basically that one of the people who founded this band beforehand was basically suffering from PTSD after the war itself, and unfortunately ended his own life a fair amount of years later because of it. And he told me a lot of things which were really insightful, and I loved about it. By why am I telling you this? Why am I not sharing with you the interview? Well, the recording is basically corrupted, and we did a phone call, and my side was recorded while his side was not, and that's so excruciatingly painful for me because I've been waiting for this moment for a long time. So I'm sorry for you all, and I'm sorry for you, Efraim, if you're watching this right now. Hopefully you'll forgive me, but I still want to thank you for the fantastic call and the things you've given and the information you informed me with. And you know what, I don't want to stress this more. Let's just go back to the video. Now, moving on to the cover of this album shows a hippie doing basically hard drugs on it, and he is pretty affected by it. Now, this of course is the symbolization of what the war does to the mind and the body, and they chose to represent it in a very grotesque way, and I totally understand that. And for all of you people who are watching maybe from the United States, this is very akin to the Vietnam War and what it did to a lot of people who came back from it. But the funny thing is that the band themselves, Zingalé, actually thought that this cover looked horrendous and it looked very ugly, and they actually said that in interviews with them. And the fact is they wanted to change this cover, but the publishers prevailed and this cover stayed as it is. But yes, this is a pretty ugly ass cover. Now, when it comes to the rating of this album, I'm gonna have to give it a 7 out of 10. Now, honestly, I would have given it an 8 out of 10, but the mixing on it is so bad. Although I got used to it at some point, it still wasn't really good and it wasn't adding to the experience, and that's just a shame because this album is totally an 8 out of 10 material, but I have to give it a 7 because I can't overlook this glaring issue. But I hope that you all enjoyed watching this video. I had a fantastic time making it and I'm so happy I got to interview some of the original creators of this album in person. Well, not really in person, I guess, because, you know, COVID and stuff like that. And do stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to the album Beyond Man and Time by the band RPWL. But until then, I hope you all have a wonderful day and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye guys.